Welcome to another story written by Oracle 1. The Shadows That Moves of the Ancient Crypt. Chapter 1. The wind had died hours before Marcus Bell arrived at the crypt. The forest around the ruined church stood in absolute stillness, branches frozen against the pale sky like the ribs of a great skeleton. The road that had once led here had long ago collapsed into dirt and roots, forcing Marcus to abandon his car nearly a mile away. By the time he reached the clearing, the last light of dusk had bled into a dull gray twilight. The church itself was little more than a carcass of stone. Its roof had collapsed inward decades ago, leaving jagged beams exposed like broken bones. Moss coated the walls. Ivy strangled the windows where stained glass had once filtered sunlight into holy colors. Now the openings stared empty and black. Marcus paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the place with the quiet patience of a man who had spent most of his life chasing stories that others dismissed as rumor. The ancient crypt beneath the church had been sealed for over 2 centuries. At least, that was what the town records claimed. But over the past few months, the locals had begun whispering again. Livestock found drained of life near the woods. Strange movements glimpsed in the abandoned church after sunset. And most unsettling of all, shadows moving across the cracked stone walls when no light source existed to cast them. Marcus did not believe in hauntings. He believed in explanations. And explanations required observation. He adjusted the strap of the camera bag on his shoulder and stepped into the clearing. The air felt colder immediately. Not the simple chill of evening, but a deeper cold that seemed to rise from the earth itself. His boots crunched softly across gravel and fallen leaves as he approached the ruined church entrance. The wooden doors had long since rotted away, leaving the doorway open like a mouth. Beyond it, darkness pooled inside the skeletal structure. Marcus switched on his headlamp. The beam cut a narrow tunnel through the gloom, illuminating broken pews scattered across the floor and the shattered remains of an altar at the far end of the nave. Dust hung motionless in the air. The silence felt wrong. Churches, even abandoned ones, tended to echo with subtle sounds: wind through cracks, insects nesting in wood, distant animal movement. But this place felt sealed, isolated, as if the outside world had stopped touching it long ago. Marcus stepped inside. The temperature dropped another few degrees. The smell reached him immediately: damp stone, mildew, and something older that carried a faint metallic edge. He moved slowly down the central aisle. The beam of his headlamp passed across fallen beams, broken statues, and the crumbling base of a stone pulpit. The walls were scarred with cracks that spidered through the ancient masonry. Then his light reached the altar. Or what remained of it. Behind the shattered stone slab was a staircase descending into darkness. The entrance to the crypt. Marcus felt a small pulse of excitement. He removed his camera from the bag and snapped several photographs before approaching the stairs. The stone steps were narrow and steep, carved directly into the earth beneath the church. Moisture glistened along the walls, forming dark veins that trailed downward into the unseen depths. He aimed the headlamp down the stairwell. The light faded after a few yards, swallowed by blackness. Marcus hesitated only a moment before beginning his descent. The sound of his boots echoed softly against the stone. Step, step, step. Each footfall carried farther than it should have. The air grew colder with every step downward. By the time he reached the bottom, his breath had begun to fog faintly in the beam of the lamp. The crypt stretched before him, a long, arched chamber supported by rows of thick stone columns. Burial niches lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Most had been sealed with stone plates centuries ago. Others had cracked open with age. Marcus stepped forward carefully. His light revealed faded carvings etched into the walls, religious symbols, dates long worn away, fragments of names nearly erased by time. This crypt had been built when the church first stood here, sometime in the early 17th century. The earliest settlers had buried their dead beneath sacred ground, believing the church would protect them. Even after death, Marcus moved deeper into the chamber. His footsteps disturbed thin layers of dust that had likely gone untouched for decades. He paused near the first open burial niche. Inside lay bones, a skull resting atop a collapsed ribcage. Fragments of cloth clung to the remains like brittle shadows. Marcus leaned closer, examining the interior with professional detachment. Then something shifted. Not the bones, the wall behind them. He straightened slowly. His light moved across the crypt wall. Nothing, just cracked stone and centuries of grime. Marcus frowned and stepped back. The headlamp beam widened slightly as he turned. And that was when he noticed the shadows. They stretched across the far wall of the crypt, tall, thin shapes cast by the stone columns behind him. But something about them felt wrong. Marcus counted quickly. There were 7 columns in the chamber. But 8 shadows. He turned around. 7 columns stood exactly where they should. Nothing else behind him. Marcus turned back to the wall. 8 shadows still stretched across the stone. He stepped sideways. 7 shadows moved with him. The 8th remained still. Marcus's heartbeat quickened. He raised the light higher. The beam widened. The shadows sharpened. The unmoving shadow stood slightly apart from the others. Long, thin, human-shaped, but there was no body standing to cast it. Marcus stared. The shadow shifted, not with his movement. On its own, it leaned slightly along the wall, like a figure adjusting its weight. Marcus felt a chill slide down his spine. "Okay," he muttered quietly. "Interesting." He lifted the camera and snapped a photograph. The flash exploded in the darkness. For a fraction of a second, the crypt flooded with white light. And in that instant, he saw dozens of shadows. Not 8, not 10, dozens. They clung to the walls, crawling across the ceiling, pooling along the floor like spilled ink. And when the flash faded, they were gone again. Only the 8 remained. Marcus lowered the camera slowly. The unmoving shadow had moved again. It now stood slightly closer. The distance between it and the other shadows had shrunk. Marcus took a cautious step backward. All the normal shadows moved with him. The 8th shadow slid forward, matching the movement, closing the gap. The air in the crypt felt thicker now. Colder. Marcus turned his headlamp toward the floor. His own shadow stretched long across the stone. Behind it, the 7th column cast its shape. But there was still one more shadow. Still standing, still moving, and slowly, it raised an arm. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Because his own arms remained at his sides. The shadow's arm reached toward him across the wall. The stone beneath it darkened. The shape thickened, growing deeper, more solid. Marcus stepped back again. The shadow followed. The other shadows continued to obey the laws of light. But this one no longer behaved like a reflection. It behaved like something alive. Marcus turned toward the staircase. Just one glance. Just to confirm his way out. The moment his eyes left the wall, the crypt behind him darkened. Not gradually. Instantly. His headlamp flickered. The light dimmed to a weak yellow glow. Marcus spun back around. The wall was covered in shadows now. Dozens. Hundreds. They moved slowly across the stone like living things stretching after a long sleep. Arms lengthening. Heads turning. Forms sliding along the ancient carvings. And every single one of them was facing him. Marcus felt his legs refuse to move. The nearest shadow peeled itself slightly away from the wall. Its edges blurred. Its shape thickened. And in a voice that sounded like dry stone scraping together, it whispered from the darkness. "You should not have brought light down here." Marcus took a single step backward. The shadows moved forward. All of them. And behind him, The staircase leading back to the church went completely dark. Chapter 2. Marcus did not move. The darkness behind him pressed like a wall. The staircase that had led him down into the crypt was still there. He knew it was, but the headlamp could no longer reach it. The beam faded into a thick blackness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And the shadows were still moving. They did not rush him. They did not lunge. They simply shifted along the ancient stone walls with a slow, deliberate patience that felt far worse than sudden violence. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly. His mind clung desperately to logic. Shadows cannot move without light. Shadows cannot speak. Shadows cannot think. Yet the wall before him rippled with them. Dozens, perhaps more. Their shapes stretched unnaturally across the stone, some tall and thin, others twisted into unnatural angles. Arms elongated, heads tilted, fingers that dragged across the walls like dripping ink. The one that had first moved, the eighth shadow, stood closest to him. Its arm was still raised, still reaching. Marcus swallowed and forced words through the dryness in his throat. "Who's there?" The crypt answered with silence. Then the shadows shifted again. A slow ripple passed through them, like wind through tall grass. And the voice came again. Not from one shadow. From all of them. "You should not have come." The sound carried no emotion. It did not sound angry or threatening. It sounded ancient. Marcus raised his camera again almost reflexively and fired another flash. White light exploded across the crypt. For a single instant, the entire chamber revealed itself. The burial niches, the stone columns, the centuries of dust, and the shadows. They were everywhere, clinging to the ceiling, crawling along the columns, layered across the walls in thick, writhing clusters. The flash faded. The darkness returned. But something had changed. Marcus felt it immediately. The air had grown heavier, colder. The shadows were closer. The eighth shadow now stretched nearly halfway across the chamber floor. Reaching for him, Marcus backed away instinctively. His boot struck something on the ground. Bone. The skull from the open burial niche rolled across the floor and struck a column with a hollow crack. The sound echoed through the crypt. And the shadows reacted. They moved faster now, sliding across the stone in long, gliding motions. The raised arm of the nearest shadow lowered slowly until its dark fingers touched the floor. Then it began to crawl toward him. Marcus spun toward the staircase. Enough. He stepped quickly through the chamber, forcing himself not to look at the walls. His light flickered again. The beam dimmed, then steadied. The staircase came into view. Relief surged through him. He reached the first step and started climbing. 1 step, 2, 3. Then something brushed his ankle. Cold. Marcus jerked his leg upward and turned the lamp downward. A shadow stretched along the step beneath him. But it did not belong to him. The shape was wrong. The proportions unnatural. Long fingers reached upward across the stone. Grasping, Marcus leapt up the remaining steps 2 at a time and burst into the ruined church above. The night air hit him like ice. For a moment he stood in the open doorway, breathing hard. The forest beyond the clearing remained silent. No wind, no insects. The world outside felt unnaturally distant. Marcus forced himself to laugh quietly. "Just shadows," he muttered. "Just your brain playing tricks." He stepped away from the crypt entrance and crossed the broken nave. Moonlight now spilled through the shattered roof beams, casting pale silver across the ruined interior. The long shadows of the beams stretched across the stone floor. Marcus froze. There were too many. He counted again. 6 beams overhead. 7 shadows. One of the shadows moved. Not with the moonlight. Not with his movement. It slid slowly across the floor. Toward the staircase. Marcus stared. "No," he whispered. The shadow continued moving. It stretched toward the crypt entrance like spilled ink crawling across stone. Marcus felt a cold realization settle in his chest. They were not bound to the crypt. They followed light. Wherever light created darkness, they could exist. His lamp flickered again. The beam dimmed. For a moment the moonlight became the strongest light in the room. The shadows deepened, and they moved faster. Several shapes slid along the broken walls. Others stretched across the fallen pews. Marcus grabbed his bag and rushed toward the doorway. He stepped outside into the clearing. The moon hung low over the trees now, casting long black silhouettes across the grass. Marcus hurried toward the forest path that led back to his car. Halfway across the clearing he stopped. Something felt wrong. He looked down. His shadow stretched ahead of him in the moonlight. But it did not match his posture. Marcus raised his right arm. His shadow's arm remained still. He lowered it again. The shadow lifted its arm slowly. Marcus stumbled backward. The shadow stepped forward. And then it separated. It peeled itself off the ground. Not rising upward. Standing. A flat black shape pulling free from the earth like wet cloth lifted from stone. It stood upright before him. Human-shaped. Featureless. Its edges wavered slightly as if made of smoke. But it cast no shadow of its own. Marcus could not breathe. The shape tilted its head, studying him. Behind it, the shadows of the trees began to stir. Long shapes sliding between trunks. Dozens of them. Emerging. Marcus turned and ran. Branches clawed at his jacket as he forced his way through the forest trail. His lamp bounced wildly, throwing frantic beams of light through the trees. Every step created new shadows. And those shadows moved. He saw them dart between trunks. Gliding along the ground beside him. Stretching across rocks and roots. Matching his pace. Keeping close. The forest seemed darker than before. Deeper. The moonlight faded beneath the canopy. Marcus's lamp flickered violently. The beam sputtered. Once. Twice. Then dimmed to a weak glow. "Come on," he muttered desperately. "Stay on." The path curved ahead. He could see the faint outline of his car through the trees. Relief surged through him again. He ran harder. Behind him, the forest rustled. Not with wind, with movement. Shadows slipping across leaves. The whispering returned. Not from the crypt this time. From the darkness around him. They bring the light. They always bring the light. Marcus reached the car and fumbled for his keys. The shadows pooled beneath the vehicle. Long dark shapes stretching outward from beneath the tires. His hand trembled as he unlocked the door and climbed inside. The moment he shut the door, the whispering stopped. Marcus sat frozen in the driver's seat. The forest outside remained still. The shadows on the ground looked normal again. Just shadows. He exhaled slowly. Then he turned the key in the ignition. The engine started. The headlights flared on. Bright white beams cut across the trees. And the forest exploded with movement. Hundreds of shadows erupted across the ground and trunks, stretching violently in every direction. Not fleeing the light, running toward it, Marcus slammed the car into reverse. The vehicle lurched backward down the dirt path. The headlights swung wildly across the forest. Wherever the light struck, the shadows surged forward. Stretching, growing, multiplying. Marcus shifted into drive and sped down the narrow road toward the highway. Branches scraped against the sides of the car. The shadows followed. They clung to the beams of light like living stains. Riding the headlights, traveling with him, Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The road opened ahead. The forest began to thin. Streetlights glowed faintly in the distance. Safety, civilization, light everywhere. He nearly laughed in relief. Then he glanced into the rearview mirror. And his heart stopped, because the back seat was not empty. A shadow sat there, perfectly still, perfectly shaped like a person. And when the headlights passed beneath the first street lamp, the shadow leaned forward slowly, until its head was inches from the back of Marcus's own. Chapter 3. Marcus did not scream. The sound rose in his throat, but something inside him forced it back down. Because screaming would mean accepting what he had just seen. And Marcus Bell had spent his entire life refusing to accept things that could not be explained. The car continued down the narrow road, headlights slicing through the forest as branches whipped past the windows. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. Not the mirror. Not the backseat. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles burned white. The shadow behind him had leaned forward. He had seen it, but shadows did not exist without light. Which meant, Marcus's mind scrambled desperately for logic. Perhaps something had fallen onto the seat. A coat. Equipment shifting in the bag. His brain had interpreted it wrong. Yes, that was possible. The road curved gently as the forest began thinning toward the outskirts of town. Streetlights glowed ahead like distant stars. Marcus inhaled slowly. Then he looked into the mirror again. The shadow was still there, sitting upright in the backseat. Its shape was unmistakable now. A human outline formed entirely of darkness. It did not blur with the movement of the car. It did not distort as shadows normally would. It sat perfectly still, watching him. Marcus's pulse hammered in his ears. The first streetlight passed overhead. The interior of the car brightened. And the shadow moved. It leaned closer. The darkness that formed its head stretched toward Marcus's neck. Marcus slammed his foot on the accelerator. The engine roared. The car surged forward down the road toward town. The shadow did not retreat. Instead, it spread. Its arms lengthened across the seat. Dark fingers crawled slowly along the upholstery like spilled ink searching for cracks. Marcus felt the temperature inside the car drop sharply. His breath fogged faintly in the air. "No," he whispered. He flicked on the interior dome light. Warm yellow light filled the cabin. The back seat was empty. Marcus blinked. Nothing there. Just worn fabric and the strap of his camera bag lying across the seat. He exhaled sharply. God, his laugh sounded thin. Just stress. Just his imagination. He turned off the dome light. The interior darkened again. The shadow returned immediately. This time it was closer. Its head hovered directly behind Marcus's own. Its arms stretched forward along the seat back. Marcus slammed the dome light on again. Empty. Light off. The shadow returned. Marcus's mind began racing. It wasn't the shadows in the world around him. It was the darkness itself. Whenever light vanished, the shadows appeared. They lived in the absence. In the spaces light could not reach. Which meant the only way to stop them. Marcus turned every light on inside the car. The dome light, the dashboard brightness, even the flashlight from his bag, which he propped against the console so it shone toward the back seat. The interior of the car flooded with harsh white light. The shadow vanished again. Marcus drove faster. The town lights grew larger ahead. Street lamps lined the road now, one after another casting steady pools of yellow light across the pavement. Every time the car passed beneath one, the darkness inside the vehicle shifted. And every time the shadow tried to return. But the interior lights forced it back. Marcus's breathing slowly steadied. He reached the edge of town and pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour gas station. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Marcus cut the engine but left the lights on. The cabin glowed with artificial brightness. The shadow did not return. Marcus sat there for several minutes, breathing slowly, trying to regain control of his thoughts. Finally, he stepped out of the car. The cold night air wrapped around him. The gas station was empty except for a bored attendant behind the window. Marcus walked around the car slowly. He opened the back door. Nothing inside, just seats. Normal shadows beneath the dashboard and along the floor. But those shadows did not move. Marcus closed the door and leaned against the car. His heart was finally beginning to slow. Maybe the shadows had only followed him because he had disturbed the crypt. Maybe leaving had broken whatever connection existed. Maybe the overhead lights flickered, just once, but Marcus noticed. Every shadow in the parking lot shifted slightly. The long shapes beneath the pumps stretched across the pavement. Marcus turned slowly. The forest road behind him was barely visible now in the distance. And far beyond the trees, where the ruined church stood miles away, the horizon looked darker than it should, as if a vast shape blocked the faint starlight. Marcus felt a deep, crawling dread rise in his chest. He hurried back into the car. Lights on, doors locked. He started the engine again and drove toward home. The town streets were well lit. Neon signs glowed. Traffic lights blinked red and green. The darkness seemed ordinary again. Marcus reached his apartment building 20 minutes later. He parked beneath the underground garage lights and stepped out. Fluorescent lamps hummed overhead. No moving shadows. No whispering. Just silence. Marcus grabbed his camera bag and headed inside. The elevator carried him up to the 4th floor. Bright hallway lights stretched along the corridor outside his apartment. Safe. Ordinary. Marcus unlocked the door and stepped inside. He immediately turned on every light. The kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. Warm yellow light filled the apartment. He set the bag down on the table and exhaled slowly. "You're fine," he said aloud. The words echoed softly through the empty room. He poured a glass of water from the sink and drank it quickly. His hands had finally stopped shaking. The shadows here behaved normally. The lamp beside the couch cast a soft silhouette across the wall. His own shadow stretched along the floor. Nothing moved. Nothing whispered. Marcus sat down heavily on the couch. His body felt exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept him moving was fading. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough to rest. The apartment lights hummed softly. Minutes passed. Marcus opened his eyes again. The room had grown darker. He frowned. Several of the lights had turned off. The kitchen was dark. The hallway light was out. Only the lamp beside the couch remained on. Marcus stood slowly. "I didn't turn those off." He crossed the room and flipped the kitchen switch. Nothing happened. The bulb remained dark. Marcus tried another switch. Dead. The lamp behind him flickered. Marcus turned slowly. The shadow on the wall had changed. It was no longer shaped like him. It was taller. Its head bent at an unnatural angle. Marcus felt the cold again. Deep. Rising from the floor. The lamp flickered harder. The shadow stretched across the wall. Then another shadow appeared beside it. And another. Dozens of them began spreading across the walls of the apartment. Marcus backed away slowly. No, I left the crypt." The shadows slid down from the walls onto the floor. Pooling together. Merging. Growing darker. Thicker. The whispering returned. Not distant this time. Not echoing through stone. Inside the room. Inside his head. "You brought the light." Marcus stumbled toward the door. The handle would not turn. The shadows spread across the floor beneath his feet. Cold fingers wrapped around his ankles. More shadows peeled away from the walls. Rising. Standing. Surrounding him. Marcus looked up at the final light still burning in the room. The lamp beside the couch flickered one last time. Then it went out. Darkness swallowed the apartment completely. For several seconds there was only silence. Then a single shadow appeared on the far wall. It moved slowly. Steadily. Its shape unmistakable. Marcus Bell. Standing still. Watching. Behind it, dozens of other shadows shifted quietly across the darkness. And far beneath the ruined church in the ancient crypt, the walls that had once held hundreds of shadows now stood nearly empty. Only a few thin shapes still clung to the stone, waiting for the next person who would bring light into the darkness. For more stories, like and subscribe.